The rain wasn't just falling on Beacon Street that night. It was punishing. Standing on the wet pavement, Charlotte stared at the heavy oak doors of the house she had cleaned, managed and loved for 5 years. They didn't just lock her out. They threw her twin daughters' car seats onto the lawn like garbage. Her husband, Richard, stood in the window, a glass of scotch in hand, watching his mother scream that Charlotte was a parasite. They thought they were discarding a penniless orphan. They had no idea that the parasite shivering in the driveway owned the bank that held their mortgage. This is the story of how the Sinclair family threw away their salvation, and how Charlotte Kensington came back to collect the debt. The sound of a deadbolt sliding into place has a finality to it that echoes in your bones. For Charlotte Sinclair, born Charlotte Kensington, that sound marked the end of a 5-year masquerade, though not the one her husband's family suspected. It was 11:15 p.m. on a Tuesday in November. Boston was experiencing a nor'easter, the kind that turns the historic cobblestones of Beacon Hill into slick, treacherous traps. Charlotte stood on the bottom step of the brownstone, her hair plastered to her skull, shivering violently. In her arms, she clutched 2 terrified, wailing toddlers, Maya and Sophie. "Please!" Charlotte screamed, her voice cracking against the wind. "Beatrice, please, it's freezing! At least let the girl stay inside." The front door cracked open, but only as far as the security chain allowed. The face of Beatrice Sinclair, her mother-in-law, appeared in the gap. It was a face that had launched 1,000 charity galas, composed of expensive creams and sheer malice. "The girls are Sinclair blood, unfortunately," Beatrice hissed, her voice cutting through the rain. "But they are tainted by you. I told Richard 5 years ago that marrying a waitress from a diner in Southie was a mistake. Tonight, he finally agreed." "Richard!" Charlotte yelled past Beatrice, seeing her husband's silhouette in the hallway. He was wearing the cashmere sweater she had bought him for Christmas, bought with money she had saved from couponing, or so she had told him. "Richard, look at your daughters. They are freezing." "Richard." Sinclair stepped into the light. He looked tired. He looked weak. He looked exactly like the man who had drained his family's trust fund on bad crypto investments and blamed the economy. "Mother says it's for the best, Lottie," Richard said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We need to sell the house. We need to liquidate. You and the kids are just too much overhead. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, said the annulment is cleaner if you're gone tonight." "Overhead," Charlotte whispered the word, tasting like bile. "We are your family." "You are a liability," Beatrice snapped. She unhooked the chain and threw a black trash bag onto the wet stoop. It landed with a wet thud. "Your clothes, or some of them. Don't come back. If you step foot on this property again, I'll call Commissioner Evans. You know we have dinner with him on Sundays. Who do you think he'll believe, the Sinclair matriarch or the gold-digging nobody?" The door slammed. Then the deadbolt. Click. Charlotte stood there for a long moment, the rain mixing with the hot tears on her face. Maya. Her 3-year-old tugged at her wet coat. "Mummy cold. Home. No baby." Charlotte choked out, hoisting Sophie higher on her hip and grabbing the wet trash bag with a trembling hand. "Not home. Not anymore." She dragged her children and her dignity down the street, away from the warmth of the gas lamps toward the main road where she could maybe flag down a taxi she couldn't afford. But as she walked, the despair began to harden into something else, something cold and sharp. Beatrice Sinclair had called her a gold-digging nobody. It was ironic, really, because inside the lining of the coat, Charlotte was wearing a coat she had claimed was a knockoff from Primark, was a hidden pocket. And inside that pocket was a black American Express Centurion card issued to Charlotte van der Hoven Kensington. The Sinclairs thought they were broke because of the market. They didn't know they were only afloat because Charlotte had been secretly injecting funds into Richard's failing architecture firm through shell companies for 3 years. She stopped at the corner of Charles Street. She looked back at the towering Sinclair brownstone. "You want to liquidate?" Charlotte whispered to the rain. "Okay, Richard. Let's see what happens when the overhead stops paying the bills." The Motel 6 in Braintree was a far cry from Beacon Hill. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and lemon cleaner, and the carpet was sticky. But the heater worked, and that was all that mattered. Charlotte stripped the wet clothes off the girls, wrapping them in the scratchy motel towels. She hummed a lullaby, the same one her grandmother used to sing to her in their estate in Zurich, long before Charlotte had run away from that life. Once the girls were asleep, huddled together in the single queen bed, Charlotte sat on the floor with her back against the door. She opened the trash bag Beatrice had thrown. Inside were her jeans, a few sweaters, and a photo frame of her and Richard from their wedding day. She pulled the photo out and looked at it. She had loved him. She really had. When they met, she was posing as a student, trying to escape the suffocating pressure of the Kensington legacy, a global shipping and real estate empire that made the Sinclairs look like paupers. She wanted to be loved for herself, not her billions. So she became Lottie, the waitress. When Richard fell for her, she thought she had won the lottery of life. She didn't realize she had married a man who was only good when life was easy. As soon as the Sinclair money started to dry up thanks to Richard's gambling and Beatrice's lavish spending, the kindness evaporated. Charlotte reached into her bra and pulled out a small waterproof pouch. Inside was a burner phone she kept for emergencies. She dialed a number that she hadn't called in 4 years. It rang once. "Sterling Private Intelligence and Legal," a crisp British voice answered. "This line is for priority clients only. Identify." "It's me, Arthur," Charlotte said, her voice steady now. "Authentication code KEN 77 Omega." There was a pause on the line, followed by the sound of a chair scraping back and a gasp. "Miss Charlotte." "Good God. We've been monitoring the inactive accounts for years. Your grandmother, she passed last spring. We couldn't find you." "I know," Charlotte said, looking at her sleeping daughters. "I was playing house. I was trying to be normal." "Is the experiment over, ma'am?" Arthur asked gently. "The experiment failed, Arthur. They threw me out. Me and the great-granddaughters of Silas Kensington. They threw us out in the rain." The silence on the other end was heavy with professional fury. Arthur Sterling wasn't just a lawyer. He was the Kensington family's fixer, a man who could dismantle a corporation with a single memo. "I need a status report on the Sinclair holdings," Charlotte said, shifting into the CEO mode she had been bred for. Specifically, Sinclair Architecture and the family trust. "One moment." The sound of rapid typing. "It's grim, ma'am. They are leveraged to the hilt. The only reason they haven't defaulted on the Beacon Hill property is a monthly injection from an anonymous angel investor known as Red Lion Holdings. That's me," Charlotte said. "Red Lion is my private shell." "I see. And the firm, Sinclair Architecture." "It's currently bidding on the waterfront redevelopment project, correct?" "Yes," Arthur confirmed. "If they get that contract, they stay solvent. If they lose it, the banks foreclose within 30 days. Who is the head of the committee deciding the contract?" That would be Councilman James O'Reilly, but the final approval comes from the primary investor of the redevelopment land. And who owns the land, Arthur? Well, technically you do, Miss Charlotte. Through the Kensington Global Real Estate Division, you acquired the Boston Harbor lots 5 years ago before you went undercover. Charlotte looked at the cracked ceiling of the motel room. A slow, cold smile spread across her face. Arthur, I want you to freeze the Red Lion payments immediately. Not a penny more to the Sinclair accounts. Consider it done. Shall I send a car for you? No, Charlotte said. Not yet. I need to be Lottie for a little while longer. I need them to think they've won. But Arthur, yes, ma'am, prepare the Gulf Stream and get me a meeting with James O'Reilly. Tell him the owner of the waterfront land is finally coming to town to personally oversee the bid selection. And if Richard Sinclair asks for a meeting, let him beg, Charlotte said. Let him beg to a secretary. I want to watch them sweat. She hung up the phone. She wasn't just a scorned wife anymore. She was Charlotte Kensington, and school was back in session. 3 weeks had passed since the night of the storm. For the Sinclairs, life had returned to what they considered normalcy, which mostly consisted of spending money they didn't have to impress people they didn't like. Richard Sinclair sat in his corner office overlooking the Boston skyline. The office was decorated in minimalist chrome and leather, cold, expensive, and imposing. It was designed to intimidate clients, to scream success. But today, the silence in the room felt heavy. His CFO, a balding man named Gary Miller, knocked on the glass door and entered without waiting for a response. Gary looked pale. Richard, we have a problem with payroll, Gary said, clutching a tablet to his chest. Richard didn't look up from his blueprints. Just pull from the operating account, Gary. Why are you bothering me with this? I'm finalizing the waterfront pitch for Councilman O'Reilly. The operating account is empty, Richard, Gary said, his voice trembling. Richard spun his chair around, a scowl deepening the lines on his forehead. Don't be ridiculous. The monthly transfer from Red Lion Holdings was due yesterday. It's the first of the month. $50,000. It's automatic. It didn't come. Richard laughed, a harsh barking sound. It's a glitch. Call the bank. Call the liaison for Red Lion. I did, Gary whispered. The number is disconnected, Richard. And the email bounced back. Recipient unknown. I called the bank, and they said the standing order was cancelled from the source. Richard stood up, his expensive chair rolling back and hitting the window with a dull thud. Cancelled? That's impossible. That investor has been keeping us afloat for 3 years. Why would they stop now? Maybe they heard about the divorce, Gary suggested. Maybe they don't like instability. Nobody knows about the divorce yet, Richard snapped. Beatrice made sure of that. We told everyone Lottie went to visit a sick relative in wherever she's from, Iowa, Idaho. Who cares? Richard grabbed his phone. He needed to call his mother. If the business account was dry, he needed to dip into the family trust to cover payroll just for a few days until the waterfront contract was signed. That contract was worth $40 million. Once he signed that, he wouldn't need Red Lion or anyone else. He dialed Beatrice. Richard, darling. Beatrice's voice was shrill, competing with background noise that sounded like a busy boutique. I am at Saks. You will not believe the incompetence here. My card was declined. The platinum one. Can you believe the audacity? Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Which card, Mother? The joint trust card, obviously. I'm trying to buy this delightful cashmere set for the O'Reilly dinner. Fix it, Richard. It's embarrassing. Mother, Richard said, loosening his tie as the room suddenly felt very hot. Put the clothes back. Leave the store. Excuse me. The trust. The trust is linked to the same collateral as the business loans. If Red Lion pulled out, Richard's voice trailed off as the realization hit him like a freight train. Charlotte hadn't just been a waitress. She had handled the household bills. She had organized his filing cabinet. She had been the one to mail the correspondence to the investors. No, he thought. That's paranoid. She was scrubbing floors. She doesn't know how finance works. "Just leave the store, mother," Richard yelled, slamming the phone down. Meanwhile, across the city in the presidential suite of the Mandarin Oriental, the atmosphere was very different. Charlotte stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror. The terrified woman in the soaked coat was gone. In her place stood Charlotte Kensington. She was wearing a tailored navy pantsuit from Armani, the sharp lines accentuating her posture. Her hair, previously tied back in a messy bun to clean toilets, was now blown out in sleek chestnut waves that cascaded over her shoulders. Arthur Sterling sat on the velvet sofa, sipping an espresso. The twins Maya and Sophie were playing on the plush carpet with a set of handcrafted wooden blocks that cost more than Richard's car. "The panic has started," Arthur reported, checking his tablet. Beatrice attempted a purchase of $3,000 at Saks Fifth Avenue. Declined. "Richard has been trying to reach the Red Lion Shell Company for 2 hours. He's currently screaming at a bank teller on State Street." Charlotte adjusted her cuff, revealing a vintage Cartier watch, a family heirloom she had retrieved from a safety deposit box that morning. "Let them scream," Charlotte said coolly. "What about the waterfront project? The final presentation is in 4 days. The City Council is hosting a gala tonight at the Boston Public Library to meet the investors. Richard will be there. He's desperate to corner Councilman O'Reilly." "And the owner of the land?" Charlotte asked, turning to face him. "Has the mysterious owner of the Kensington Group confirmed attendance?" "She has." Arthur smiled. "Though the guest list simply says Kensington representative, they are expecting an old man in a suit, maybe a proxy." Charlotte walked over to the window, looking out at the city that had treated her like trash for 5 years. She remembered the nights she had stayed up late, helping Richard with his designs, correcting his math, suggesting material changes work. He took credit for claiming she wouldn't understand the complexities. "They aren't expecting me," Charlotte said. "Richard sees what he wants to see. He saw a waitress, so he treated me like a servant. Tonight, I'm going to show him exactly what he threw away." "Are you sure you want to do this, ma'am?" Arthur asked gently. "We could just crush him remotely, bankrupt the firm by Friday. You never have to see him again." Charlotte looked at the twins. Sophie held up a block and smiled. "Look, Mummy Tower. He threw my children in the rain." "Arthur," Charlotte said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Bankruptcy is too easy. I want to look him in the eye when the realization hits. I want to see the moment his world breaks." The Bates Hall in the Boston Public Library was magnificent. Under the green banker's lamps and the barrel-vaulted ceiling, the elite of Boston society mingled, holding flutes of champagne and discussing the fate of the city's skyline. Richard Sinclair adjusted his tuxedo. He was sweating despite the air conditioning. The last 3 days had been a nightmare of dodging creditors and lying to his staff. He had told everyone it was a banking error. If he didn't secure the waterfront contract tonight, or at least get a verbal commitment from O'Reilly, Sinclair Architecture would be insolvent by Monday morning. "Stand up straight," Beatrice hissed, appearing at his elbow. She was wearing an old gown, having failed to buy a new one, and she was in a foul mood. "You look like a waiter. Go talk to O'Reilly. He's over there by the bar." "I'm trying, mother," Richard snapped. "He's surrounded by sharks. Everyone wants this contract." "Well, go take it," Beatrice commanded. "You are a Sinclair. You deserve it more than these new money vulgarians." Richard straightened his spine and began to weave through the crowd. He spotted Councilman James O'Reilly, a stout man with a red face, laughing with a group of developers. "Councilman," Richard said, forcing a charming smile as he approached. "Richard Sinclair. Wonderful evening, isn't it?" O'Reilly turned his eyes, glazing over slightly. "Ah, Sinclair. Good to see you. Heard you had a bit of a hiccup with your financing recently." Richard froze. How did he know rumors, Councilman? Mere administrative mix-ups. Sinclair architecture is stronger than ever. In fact, I have some new renderings for the harbor that I think— "Actually," Richard O'Reilly interrupted, looking past him. "We're all waiting for the landowner, the Kensington Group. They've been totally silent partners until now, but word is they're flying in a heavy hitter to make the final decision on the contractor." "Kensington," Beatrice scoffed, stepping into the circle. "Old European money, probably dusty and out of touch. We can handle them, Richard." Suddenly the room went quiet. The hush started at the grand entrance and rippled through the hall like a wave. The heavy double doors swung open. Walking in wasn't an old man in a grey suit. It was a woman. She was wearing a floor-length gown of crimson silk that seemed to move like liquid fire. It was backless daring and utterly commanding. Diamonds real heavy, flawless diamonds glittered at her throat and ears. She walked not with the hesitancy of a guest, but with the authority of the host. Flanking her were two large security guards and a sharp-looking man in a tuxedo carrying a briefcase, Arthur Sterling. Richard squinted. The woman looked familiar. The curve of her jaw, the way she held her head. But the aura was wrong. This woman radiated power. She looked like she could buy the entire library and turn it into a closet. The woman stopped in the center of the room. Councilman O'Reilly practically tripped over himself to get to her. Miss Kensington," O'Reilly stammered. The woman turned. Her profile caught the light. Richard dropped his champagne glass. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound echoing in the silence. It was Charlotte. But it wasn't his Charlotte. It wasn't the woman who wore oversized t-shirts and scrubbed oatmeal off the high chair. This woman's skin glowed with expensive treatments. Her makeup was flawless. Her eyes, usually warm and pleading, were cold, hard steel. "Lottie." Richard whispered the word, escaping him before he could stop it. Beatrice gasped, clutching her pearls. "What is she doing here? How did she get in security?" Beatrice marched forward, her face turning a violent shade of red. "You," she shrieked, pointing a finger at Charlotte. "You trash! How dare you crash this event? Did you sleep with a waiter to get a ticket? Get out! Get out before I have you arrested!" The room gasped. People murmured. Who was this crazy woman yelling at the guest of honor? Charlotte didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She slowly turned her head and looked down at Beatrice, as if examining a stain on the carpet. Arthur stepped forward, blocking Beatrice. "Mrs. Sinclair, I would advise you to lower your voice." "Don't tell me what to do," Beatrice screamed. "This woman is a parasite. She is my son's ex-wife, a penniless nobody we threw out of our house. She's probably here to beg for alimony." Richard rushed forward, grabbing his mother's arm, but his eyes were locked on Charlotte. Confusion warred with anger. "Lottie, what is this? Where did you get that dress? Who paid for this?" He looked at Arthur. "Is this him? Is this who you were seeing behind my back?" A sugar daddy. Charlotte finally spoke. Her voice was low, melodic, and amplified perfectly by the acoustics of the hall. "Hello, Richard. Hello, Beatrice." "Stop the act," Richard hissed, lowering his voice. "You're embarrassing us. You're embarrassing yourself. Go back to the motel or wherever you're staying. We can discuss child support later." Charlotte tilted her head. A small, dry smile touched her lips. "Councilman O'Reilly," Charlotte said, ignoring Richard entirely and turning to the politician. "I apologize for the disturbance. It seems the vetting process for the guest list was lacking." O'Reilly looked between Richard and Charlotte, sweating profusely. "Ms. Kensington, I assure you, Kensington." Richard laughed nervously. "Councilman, you're mistaken. Her name is Charlotte. She's a nobody. She's from South Boston." "Actually," Charlotte said, taking a step toward Richard. The heels of her Louboutins clicked ominously. "My name is Charlotte Vanderhoven Kensington. My grandmother was Eleanor Kensington, the founder of the Kensington Global Group." She gestured to the room. "I own the land you are standing on, Richard. I own the land for the waterfront project. And until 3 weeks ago, I owned the shell company that was paying your mortgage." Richard felt the world tilt. "What? Red Lion Holdings," Charlotte said softly, so only he, Beatrice, and O'Reilly could hear. "The lion is the crest of the Kensington family. I paid your debts, Richard. For 5 years, I wanted to see if you could build something on your own. I wanted to see if you loved me. For me." She leaned in close, her perfume, a scent of jasmine and oud that cost more than his car, filling his senses. "But you didn't want a partner. You wanted a servant. And when the money got tight, you threw me away like garbage." Charlotte straightened up and addressed the councilman, her voice projecting to the entire room. "Councilman O'Reilly, regarding the waterfront contract. The Kensington Group is officially rejecting the bid from Sinclair Architecture." "On what grounds?" Richard choked out, his knees shaking. "On the grounds of financial instability," Charlotte said, her eyes drilling into him. "And moral bankruptcy." She turned to Arthur. "Remove them. They are trespassing on my property." Arthur nodded to the 2 large security guards. They stepped forward, flanking Richard and Beatrice. "This is a mistake," Beatrice shrieked, as a guard took her elbow. "She's lying." "Richard, tell them she's lying." But Richard couldn't speak. He watched the woman he had discarded, the woman he had left in the rain, turn her back on him and walk toward the VIP section, the crimson dress flowing behind her like a royal train. As the guards dragged a protesting Beatrice and a stunned Richard toward the exit, Charlotte didn't look back. The Lottie he knew was dead. The lioness had arrived. The humiliation at the library was total, but Richard Sinclair was not a man to accept defeat, especially when he felt he had been tricked. The narrative in his head shifted rapidly. Charlotte wasn't the victim. She was the deceiver. She had lied to him for 5 years. She had humiliated his mother. She had destroyed his business. 2 days after the gala, Charlotte sat in the boardroom of Sterling Private Intelligence. The room was glass-walled, overlooking the harbor she now openly controlled. "He's filed for emergency custody," Arthur said, sliding a thick legal document across the mahogany table. Charlotte didn't touch it. She just stared at the harbor. "On what grounds he threw them out in the rain?" "Abandonment and fraud," Arthur replied, his voice dry. "His lawyers are arguing that by hiding your identity and assets, you entered the marriage under false pretenses. They are claiming you are mentally unstable, a pathological liar, is the phrase they used. They say your sudden wealth is evidence of illicit activity or a manic episode." Charlotte laughed, but there was no humor in it. He wants the girls because he thinks they are his ticket to my money. He doesn't care about Maya or Sophie. He didn't even know Sophie's shoe size when I left. We know that, Arthur said. But the court of public opinion is messy, and Beatrice has been busy. She gave an exclusive interview to the Boston Globe this morning. The headline is, "Billionaire heiress mocked our poverty while living in our home." Charlotte spun her chair around. She's playing the victim. She's good at it. She's painting you as a cruel sociopath who watched them struggle while sitting on a dragon's hoard of gold. It's a compelling story for people who hate the rich. Charlotte stood up and walked to the whiteboard. She picked up a marker. "Okay," she said. "If they want a war, let's give them a war. But we aren't going to fight in the tabloids. We're going to fight in the ledger." "What's the move?" "Foreclose," Charlotte said. "Trigger the clause on the Beacon Hill mortgage. They missed the payment yesterday, since Red Lion stopped funding them." "That will take months," Arthur warned. "Not that mortgage," Charlotte corrected. "The other debt, the one Richard doesn't know about." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Beatrice has a gambling problem," Charlotte revealed. "Online poker, high stakes. She's been borrowing from loan sharks in Revere for years. When I was managing the household finances, I found the slips. I bought the debt through a third party to keep her safe. I own her gambling debts, Arthur. $200,000 worth." Arthur smiled a rare, genuine expression. "You own your mother-in-law's kneecaps, essentially." "Call it in," Charlotte said coldly. "Full repayment within 48 hours, or we file a lien against her personal assets, her jewelry, her car, her furs, everything she values more than her grandchildren. And regarding the custody hearing, I'll be there," Charlotte said. "And I'm bringing witnesses, real ones." The family court hearing was a circus. Reporters crowded the steps, hungry for a glimpse of the secret billionaire. Richard arrived looking disheveled and sympathetic, holding a stuffed animal that belonged to Maya, a toy he had likely bought that morning for the cameras. Inside the judge, a stern woman named Justice Halloway looked over her glasses at the two parties. "Mr. Sinclair," the judge began, "you are claiming Mrs. Sinclair, or Miss Kensington, is unfit. She lied to me for 5 years." "Your Honor," Richard said, his voice trembling with practiced emotion. "She pretended to be poor. She watched me work myself to the bone, watched my mother stress over bills, all while sitting on millions. Who does that? A sociopath does that. I'm terrified for my daughters. I don't know who this woman is." Justice Halloway turned to Charlotte. Charlotte stood tall, wearing a modest but impeccably tailored cream suit. "Kensington, do you have a response?" "I do, Your Honor," Charlotte said calmly. "I didn't hide my money to mock them. I hid it to protect myself. I wanted a family, not a portfolio manager. And as for watching them struggle, I paid their bills for 3 years, anonymous donations. I cooked their meals. I raised those children while Richard was at networking dinners that were actually poker games." "Liar!" Beatrice shouted from the gallery. "He was working or order." Judge Halloway banged her gavel. "I have the receipts, Your Honor," Charlotte said, nodding to Arthur. He handed a stack of documents to the bailiff. "Bank transfers from Red Lion Holdings to Sinclair Architecture. Time-stamped GPS data showing Richard's phone at the Lucky Strike Casino during the times he claimed to be working. And..." Charlotte paused. She looked directly at Richard. "Video footage from the security camera I installed at the front door. Footage from November the 12th, the night they threw us out." Richard went pale. He didn't know about the camera. Arthur set up a laptop. The screen flickered to life. The courtroom watched in silence as the grainy night vision footage played. They heard the rain. They heard the girls crying. They heard Beatrice calling Charlotte a parasite. They saw the trash bag land on the wet pavement. And they saw Richard standing there, watching his wife and children walk into the storm and then closing the door. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even Beatrice looked down, unable to watch. Judge Halloway took off her glasses. She looked at Richard with pure disgust. "Mr. Sinclair," the judge said, her voice icy, "you are petitioning for custody of the children you threw out into a nor'easter." It's out of context," Richard stammered. It was a heated argument. I was going to go after them." "The video runs for another hour," Arthur interjected smoothly. "It shows Mr. Sinclair drinking scotch in the window and then going to bed. He did not come out." The gavel banged. It sounded like a gunshot. "Emergency custody denied. Judge Halloway ruled. Full temporary custody granted to the mother. Mr. Sinclair, you are granted supervised visitation 2 hours a week, subject to a psychological evaluation. And Mrs. Beatrice Sinclair," the judge glared at the older woman, "you are to have no contact with the children whatsoever." "Next case." Richard slumped in his chair. He had lost the girls. He had lost the narrative. But the worst was yet to come. As they exited the courthouse, a process server stepped in front of Beatrice. "Beatrice Sinclair." "Get out of my way," she snapped. "You are served," the man said, slapping a thick envelope into her chest. "Notice of default on promissory note number 445. The holder of the debt, Kensington Private Equity, is seizing your assets." Beatrice looked at the paper, then at Charlotte, who was standing at the top of the stairs holding her daughter's hands. "You bought my debt," Beatrice whispered, her face grey. "I told you, Beatrice," Charlotte said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "I pay my debts. Now it's time you paid yours." The downfall of the Sinclair family was fast and brutal. It wasn't just the loss of the waterfront contract. It was the social excommunication. In Boston, money talks, but old money whispers. And the Kensington whisper was powerful. Charlotte didn't have to tell anyone to blacklist Richard. She simply existed. Invitations to galas stopped arriving at the Sinclair brownstone. Richard's calls to other developers went to voicemail. The bank, seeing the loss of the Red Lion funding and the waterfront contract, called in the business loans. 2 weeks after the court hearing, Charlotte sat in her new office, the penthouse of the Prudential Center. She was looking at the blueprints for the waterfront project. "We need a new lead architect," Charlotte said to her team. "Someone innovative, someone hungry, not a dinosaur like Richard." "We have a short list," her assistant said, "but Mr. Sinclair is in the lobby. Again." Charlotte sighed. "Let him up. Security on standby." Richard entered. He looked terrible. He hadn't shaved in days and his suit was rumpled. He looked like the man he was, a man whose facade had crumbled. He stood awkwardly in the doorway of the office that was larger than his entire house. "Lottie," he said. "Charlotte," she corrected, not looking up from the blueprints. "What do you want, Richard? Your 2 hours of visitation are on Thursday." I lost the firm," Richard said, his voice breaking. "The bank seized the keys this morning. They're auctioning off the equipment on Monday." Charlotte stopped writing. She looked at him. "I know. I saw the notice. And Mother. They took her car. They took her ring. Lottie, that ring was in the family for 4 generations. It paid off about 10% of her gambling debt," Charlotte said. "She still owes me." Richard walked forward, falling to his knees in front of her desk. It was a pathetic sight. The arrogant prince reduced to a beggar. "Please," he wept. Please, Lottie. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was weak. I was stupid. But don't destroy us completely. I have nothing left. We're going to lose the house. Where will we live?" Charlotte looked at him. She thought about the rain. She thought about Maya crying cold. She thought about the 5 years she had spent loving this man, believing he was just stressed, just misunderstood. She stood up and walked around the desk. She stood over him. "You have a degree, Richard," she said. "You're an architect. You can work. No one will hire me. Not after what you did. Not as an architect, no." Charlotte agreed. "But I have a job opening." Richard looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You do?" "Yes," Charlotte said. "The waterfront project needs a site manager, someone to manage the waste disposal, the porta potties, the trash removal. It pays $18 an hour. It's honest work." Richard's face twisted in horror. "You want me to plunge toilets on a site I was supposed to design? It's a job, Richard," Charlotte said, her voice hard. "It puts food on the table. And isn't that what you told me when I was waitressing, that work is work? Or is that logic only for people you think are beneath you?" She dropped a hard hat onto the floor in front of him. It skidded and hit his knee. "Take the job or don't. But get out of my office. I have a city to build." Richard stared at the hard hat. The humiliation was total. But he had no money. He had no home. He had no choice. With a shaking hand, he reached out and picked up the yellow plastic hat. 1 year later, the transformation of the Boston waterfront was nothing short of a miracle, a metamorphosis that had rewritten the city's skyline. Where there had once been rotting, barnacle-encrusted piers and warehouses that smelled of diesel and decay, there was now the Kensington Esplanade. It was a sprawling architectural triumph of glass, steel, and native greenery that seemed to rise organically from the harbour itself. Anchoring it all was the Kensington Tower, a needle of gleaming sapphire glass that pierced the cloudless blue sky, reflecting the sun like a beacon. It was opening day, and the air was electric. A cool, crisp breeze rolled off the Atlantic, carrying the salt spray that Charlotte had once associated with the bitter cold of her eviction, but which today smelled only of promise and new beginnings. Thousands of people had gathered, a sea of Bostonians pressing against the velvet ropes. There were tourists snapping photos, locals pushing strollers along the new boardwalks, and the city's elite clustered in the VIP section, sipping champagne and pretending they hadn't spent the last decade ignoring this part of town. Charlotte stood at the podium, the polished wood cool under her fingertips. She wore a dress of structural white silk, sharp and modern, a stark contrast to the crimson gown she had worn the night she revealed her identity. Today wasn't about vengeance, it was about legacy. She looked out at the faces in the front row. There was Mayor Wu nodding encouragingly. There was Governor Healy checking her watch but smiling. And there was Councilman James O'Reilly, the man who had once tried to brush her off for a better investor, now clapping the loudest, his face flushed with the eagerness of a man who knows exactly who signs the checks. But Charlotte's eyes drifted past them, past the reporters with their flashing cameras to the side of the stage where her real life waited. Arthur Sterling stood there, impeccable as always, in a charcoal suit, but looking softer today. He was holding Sophie, now 4, who was fast asleep on his shoulder, her thumb in her mouth. Beside him, Maya was twirling a commemorative blue ribbon, laughing as it caught the wind. They looked happy. They looked safe. They looked nothing like the shivering, terrified children who had been tossed onto a wet sidewalk. This city, Charlotte began. Her voice, amplified and echoing clear across the harbour, is built on the idea of resilience. We are a city that remembers its history, but we are not bound by it. She paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment. The crowd leaned in. We build on top of what was broken. She continued, her gaze steady. We don't discard the old simply because it is weathered. We renew it. We find the value in the foundation, and we reinforce it. But her eyes narrowed slightly, a microscopic shift that only Arthur might have noticed. We also must know the difference between history worth saving and the rubble that needs to be cleared away to let the light in. The applause that followed was thunderous, a wave of sound that washed over her. It was the sound of validation of power, of total and absolute victory. But as the clapping subsided and the band struck up a celebratory jazz number, Charlotte felt a pull, a tether to the past that hadn't quite snapped. She excused herself from the dignitaries, shaking hands mechanically, accepting congratulations with a practiced smile. She handed the ceremonial giant scissors to the mayor, whispering an apology about checking on the logistics. She walked down the steps of the stage, her heels clicking rhythmically on the fresh pavement. She bypassed the press pen, ignoring the shouted questions from journalists, hungry for a quote from the elusive billionaire. Instead, she headed toward the periphery of the event, toward the service entrance of the park where the dumpsters and maintenance sheds were hidden behind tasteful cedar fencing. The noise of the party faded here, replaced by the mundane sounds of work. The clatter of bottles, the rustle of plastic bags, the hum of a compactor. A man was working there. He wore a neon yellow safety vest that was 2 sizes too big over a stained grey hoodie. He was sweeping trash near the overflowing bins, discarded flyers, empty coffee cups, the detritus of the celebration happening 50 yards away. He wore heavy work boots that were scuffed and worn, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, shielding his face from the sun and from the eyes of anyone who might recognize him. He moved with a slow, mechanical rhythm. Sweep, push, lift. Sweep, push, lift. He looked older than his 35 years. His shoulders, once held back with the arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him a living, were now stooped. His hands, which had once held only drafting pencils and crystal tumblers of scotch, were red and calloused, gripping the rough wood of the broom handle. Charlotte stopped 10 feet away. She didn't speak immediately. She just watched him. She remembered the way he used to look at her when she was scrubbing his floors with a vague, distant annoyance, as if her presence was a minor inconvenience to his genius. Now the dynamic was physically reversed. She was the statue. He was the pigeon. "You missed a spot," she said quietly. The man froze. His back went rigid. For a long, painful second, he didn't move, as if hoping he had imagined the voice. Then slowly, painfully, he turned around. Richard Sinclair looked up. The change was shocking even to Charlotte, who knew his circumstances. The handsome, boyish charm was gone, eroded by a year of hard labor and public shame. His face was gaunt, covered in a patchy stubble that spoke of apathy rather than style. His eyes, usually bright with entitlement, were dull, rimmed with red, and filled with a profound, exhausted resignation. He squinted at her, the white of her dress blinding in the sun. He looked at the diamonds in her ears, the confidence in her stance. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Miss Kensington," he muttered, his voice raspy. He dropped his gaze to his boots. He couldn't hold eye contact. "Hello, Richard," Charlotte said, her tone neutral. Not kind, not cruel, just factual. "How is the job treating you?" Richard shifted his weight, gripping the broom like a lifeline. "It's steady," he said, forcing the words out. "The foreman, he says I might get a raise next month. 50 cents an hour." "Good," Charlotte said. "That puts you slightly above minimum wage. You should be able to save." "And your mother?" she asked. Richard winced, a spasm of pain crossing his face. "She's adjusting. It's hard. The studio apartment in Revere is small. The heating is loud, and she hates the noise from the highway. She complains every day." He paused, looking up at her, with a flash of his old defensiveness quickly extinguished. "But since you garnished her pension to pay the gambling debt, it's all we can afford." Charlotte nodded. She felt no guilt. Beatrice had thrown her grandchildren into a storm. A noisy apartment was a mercy compared to what Charlotte could have done. "The girls are doing well," Charlotte said, bridging the silence. "Maya started piano lessons this week. She has an ear for it. Sophie asks about you." "Does she?" Richard's voice cracked a raw, wet sound. He wiped his nose with the back of his dirty glove. What do you tell her?" "I tell her the truth," Charlotte said. Richard flinched, bracing himself for the blow. "I tell her that her father is working on himself," Charlotte said softly. "I tell her that he is learning how to be a person before he can be a parent. I tell her that he has to build his own foundation before he can build a house for anyone else." Richard stared at her. He had expected her to say she told them he was a monster. The kindness of her truth was more painful than any insult. It highlighted exactly how far he had fallen and how much grace she possessed that he lacked. Charlotte opened her structured leather purse. She pulled out a small white envelope. It was crisp and clean against the backdrop of the garbage bins. She stepped forward and placed it on the flat plastic lid of the trash can that stood between them. Richard looked at it with suspicion. "What is this severance?" "It's not money," Charlotte said sharply. "I don't give handouts anymore, Richard. You know that. It's a brochure." "A brochure for the Bunker Hill Community College," she explained. "They have a night course in sustainable architecture and green building materials. It's a 2-year certification." Richard looked from the envelope to her face, confusion warring with hope. "If you complete it," Charlotte said, her voice firm. "And I mean actually complete it. No cheating, no paying someone to write your papers, no crying to the dean, 'Bring me your diploma.' If your grades are top tier, come to my office. We can talk about a junior draftsman position." Richard stared at the envelope. His hands were shaking. A junior draftsman was the lowest rung on the architectural ladder, a job for 20-year-olds. It was a humiliation for a man who had once owned his own firm. But it was also a rope thrown to a drowning man. Tears welled in his eyes, cutting clear tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He looked at the woman he had married, the woman he had underestimated, the woman he had discarded. He realized now that she hadn't destroyed him. She had dismantled him, taken him apart, piece by arrogant piece, so that he might actually have a chance to be built back up into something real. "Why?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "After everything I did, after the rain, after the court case, why would you help me?" Charlotte adjusted her sunglasses, shielding her eyes from the glare. She looked back toward the esplanade, toward the gleaming tower she had built from the ground up. She looked at the life she had created, a life that was full and rich and hers. She looked back at him. "Because I'm not you, Richard," she said simply. "I don't throw people away. I just put them where they belong. And right now you belong at the bottom." But you don't have to stay there. She turned on her heel. She didn't wait for a thank you. She didn't look back. She walked away, her white dress flowing behind her, moving back toward the light, the music, and the applause. She walked back to her daughters, who were waiting with open arms. Richard stood alone by the trash cans. The smell of stale beer and garbage surrounded him. He looked at the broom in his hand, the symbol of his penance. Then he looked at the white envelope on the trash can lid. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to hide behind. No Sinclair name, no trust fund, no lies. Just the work in front of him. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the envelope. He tucked it carefully into the pocket of his safety vest, right over his heart. Then he gripped the broom, took a breath, and started sweeping. And that is the story of Charlotte Kensington and the Sinclair family. It's a brutal reminder that the wheel of fortune is always turning. Richard and Beatrice thought power came from a bank account or a last name. They thought they could discard a human being just because she was inconvenient. But they forgot the most important rule of life: you never truly know who you are dealing with. Charlotte didn't just get revenge, she got justice. She stripped them of their ego, their unearned status, and forced them to face the one thing they were terrified of: reality. Now I have a question for you guys. Charlotte offered Richard a second chance at the very end, a chance to start over from the bottom. Do you think he deserved it? Or should she have left him in the dust forever? If you enjoyed this story of hard karma and redemption, please destroy that like button. Let's see if we can hit 5,000 likes on this video. And if you haven't already hit, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We upload brand new stories every single day, and you do not want to miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and remember, be careful who you step on. Today, they might be the one signing your paycheck tomorrow. See you in the next video.